Hi, and welcome back to Tales from the Gulag, my case against the ALP. And this is part 4, Labor's War on Human Rights. In my second video on Labor's war against Jesus, I made the link between religious freedom and freedom of conscience. The two are closely related. While lobby groups love to claim their issue as a human right, we need to look at the concept so that we can properly evaluate what is a genuine human right, as opposed to something that was cooked up 5 minutes ago by some political pressure group. The concept of human rights is based on the notion that there is a clear-cut and objective standard of right and wrong to which all, from top to bottom, are subject. And a major distinctive in Western culture is the concept that we are all born with inalienable rights, which come from the Judeo-Christian idea that all of us are created equal by God, who treats us all in the same way, and that we all bear the same responsibilities before him. It is only when we talk about a supreme being, and more specifically the God of Abraham and Isaac, that we can actually talk about human rights. In the Old Testament, the kings of Israel were not above the law and were frequently brought to task by the prophets for their wrong actions. So, for example, King David was condemned by the prophet Nathan for his adultery with Bathsheba and the way he tried to cover up his wrongdoing by having her husband meet an unfortunate accident in battle. For that matter, the kings of Israel were not allowed to carry out priestly functions, which would have implied some divinity for the king, and the kings that tried to do so were roundly condemned by God himself. And therefore, the king was not above the law, and with that, there was a strongly implied separation of church and state. This provides a framework from which we can relate to each other. It provides a framework not only of freedom for ourselves, but also obligations towards each other, which is applicable to everybody, and when this is in place, there is a genuine equality for all. However, while the left talks about human rights, they undercut the very basis from which we can build them because they don't believe in some higher authority. They deny that there is such a thing as a definite right and wrong, and nor is there any objective truth according to them. So who does become the higher authority? The state. Hence, leftists are ultimately universally totalitarian at heart. Labor's national policy platform again and again endorses the Yogyakarta Principles, and the subtitle of that document is Principles on the Application of International Human Rights Law in Regard to Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity. What it does is to link the gay rights movement, etc., to the civil rights movement by claiming that it is a human rights issue. And so it talks about human rights throughout, but in fact it is saying that gay rights trump everybody else's. Socialists of all stripes love human rights for themselves and for their power base, but not for anybody else. So here's what it says as an example in Principle 21. This is the Yogyakarta Principles. Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience and religion, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity. These rights may not be invoked by the state to justify laws, policies or practices which deny equal protection of the law or discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. Did you get that? We all have rights, but when these rights overlap, the state may not invoke them to, in other words, LGBT whatever rights trump everybody else's. And so it says states shall, A, take all necessary legislative, administrative and other measures to ensure the right of persons, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity, to hold and practice religious and non-religious beliefs, alone or in association with others, to be free from interference with their beliefs, and to be free from coercion or the imposition of beliefs. And B, ensure that the expression, practice and promotion of different opinions, convictions and beliefs with regard to issues of sexual orientation or gender identity is not undertaken in a manner incompatible with human rights. So you see, Yogyakarta therefore dresses up the LGBT whatever agenda as a civil rights movement. It commits states to impose a radical social engineering program on their citizens using the education system, the bureaucracy, even businesses and corporations will be co-opted into the process. But we're democratic socialists, will be the reply. We support human rights for all. To which I say, baloney. They are all for rights for themselves and their buddies, but not for anybody else. Well, Venezuela voted in their socialist regime. How are human rights going over there? Not very well, because enough of their citizens have found that socialism sucks for them and are punished for saying so. Or South Africa, another democratic socialist country. South Africans voted in Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress, and now under his successor we have the genocide of white South Africans. Last time I checked, genocide is a violation of human rights, isn't it? Or at home. An event held in Melbourne in 2018 where Stefan Molyneux and Lawrence Southern were to speak was protested by the leftist Antifa fascist thugs who started a riot. Organisers of the event, Axiomatic Events, were charged $60,000 for police protection, even though their event was entirely peaceful and none of the disorder was their fault. Clearly, this had to be gangster rule. Axiomatic Rights rightly told them to, in my words, get stuffed. They actually politely declined, citing Victorian law which said that the police are for the protection of all and for maintaining law and order for all. But this is under the radical Labor government, which gives us a foretaste of what is to come. Two potent instruments of Labor and their mates that they like to use against their opponents are hate speech and the Human Rights Commission and the various anti-discrimination boards. Number one, hate speech. This has become a very effective tool against their opponents. So if we look overseas, the Southern Poverty Law Centre was established during the days of the Civil Rights Movement in a fair enough cause to identify and monitor genuine hate groups like the Ku Klux Klan. It pretty soon became a left-wing hate group of its own, and its tactic is to target conservative groups and individuals so that they can be linked with the genuine haters. So an irony of the 2016 US presidential election campaign was when Republican candidate Ben Carson was denounced by the Southern Poverty Law Centre as a racist. That is, until it was pointed out to them that Carson was actually black, and black guys can't be racist, can they? And so he was quietly taken off his listing without even an apology, but was just quietly taken down. And then, of course, again and again, we see conservatives being targeted in the same way. Jordan Peterson, psychologist and conservative speaker, is routinely labelled as being alt-right, hence racist, except that the alt-right hate him too, and Peterson has repeatedly denounced the alt-right. Ben Shapiro, another conservative commentator, is routinely labelled as a Nazi, which is kind of funny, given that he is Jewish, and he's openly so, and he identifies himself as such by wearing the yarmulke whenever he speaks in public. And then even in Australia, the likes of Pauline Hanson and co are routinely labelled as racists for even opposing immigration policy. And that's all under the concept of hate speech. But then the other instrument is the rather Orwellian named Australian Human Rights Commission and the various state discrimination tribunals. All of these, of course, are creatures of the Labor governments that created them. They were sold as an instrument to protect those who face genuine discrimination. For example, someone who loses a job because of his skin colour. The appeal of this is that most Australians are actually not racist. But the mechanism has now become the basis for an entire industry in which people from selected minorities can now wage legal warfare against the critics of their political agendas, where the burden of proof is on the accused who bears the cost of the process. This turns things upside down. It turns upside down the notions of fair process and the presumption of innocence. I have previously highlighted the case of Archbishop Porteous. We would do well to note Major Bernard Gaynor, whose criticisms of political correctness have brought him the ire of one Gary Burns, a gay activist, who has repeatedly had him before the New South Wales Anti-Discrimination Tribunal. Although Gaynor has been repeatedly cleared of all the charges, the cost of defending himself has been crippling. Further, the New South Wales Administrative Tribunal and the Anti-Discrimination Board's actions have been ruled unconstitutional by the High Court, but they continue to entertain complaints and so show complete disregard for the law. According to Gaynor, Burns got his address from the electoral roll and passed on his personal details to various Islamic organisations, so that Gaynor's family has had to move for safety reasons. As Gaynor says, and this is a quote from him, he has also encouraged others to lodge as many complaints against me as possible in order to seize my assets, writing that it would be a lesson to me to throw my wife and 8 children onto the streets. So you see, the whole thing has created an anti-discrimination industry which is being used to target individuals who do not necessarily hate this or that group, but are opposed to their political agenda. They are targeted for that in a process that is entirely weighted against them. So not only are these agencies creatures of the Labor Party, the ALP even wants to strengthen them and bring them all under the one banner. Human rights are not the concern here so much as having a more effective means to legally threaten and intimidate their opponents. And there is more. If we go back to the draft policy platform, page 163.71, it says, they will investigate amending the Australian Human Rights Commission Act to establish a Commissioner for Sexual Orientation, Gender Identity and Intersex Status Issues, with equivalent powers, responsibilities and funding to commissioners within the Australian Human Rights Commission. Homophobic, biphobic, transphobic and intersex-phobic harassment by the written or spoken word causes actual harm, not simple mere offence, to people who have suffered discrimination and prejudice, and causes particular harm to same-sex attracted or gender questioning and intersex people, and considers such harmful harassment is an unacceptable abuse of the responsibilities that come with the freedom of speech and must be subject to effective sanctions. Labor will consider whether the current anti-discrimination law provides such effective sanctions. Now, it's interesting to point out that there was a recent attempt by the former Abbott Liberal government, taken up by the Turnbull government, which tried to amend the Clause 18C of the Anti-Discrimination Act to try to remove mere offence as the basis for an action against somebody under the Act. Now, it was interesting that particularly under pressure from the Greens and Labor that this was opposed, so that currently causing mere offence to somebody could bring an action against them, legal warfare. And really, as we have just seen, Labor actually wants to strengthen that. So they want a gay rights commissioner within the AHRC, or I'd probably actually call him a commissar. And here is a real beauty. Points 102 and 103 on page 165 under free speech. It says, Australia's anti-vilification laws strike an appropriate balance between the right to free speech and protection from the harm of hate speech. Labor stands with the community to oppose any attack on the Racial Discrimination Act. So, according to Labor, current laws are not enough. Their weaponised laws are already used to silence honest political debate, and it now promises to strengthen these laws, and as we have heard above, woe to those who dare criticise the Racial Discrimination Act. Labor, for all its talk about human rights, is actually at war against them. Because when you have special laws for special people, that's actually the end of human rights for all.